It all started with the appearance of one unaccounted for scarecrow. Brad, where did this scarecrow come from? Bradley, my oldest son, came up and looked at the strange scarecrow. He was sitting in our west field, the cornfield, and he was sharing company with 3 other scarecrows. These 3, however, were ones my son and I had made in the barn. One bore the long dress my wife had donated to the cause. Another bore a set of overalls with a slice up one knee that I had turned over. The third had a shirt and a pair of sweatpants from my middle son, Gregory. These 3 I remembered. I should, after all, since I had billed each one of them. This one, though, I did not. It was a tall fellow, a wide boater hat sitting on his sack head, with a pair of new-looking blue overalls and a checkered shirt in a dark blue, light blue pattern. Brad took a long look and shook his head. Nope, doesn't look like one of the ones we made, Daddy. I scratched my chin, wondering if maybe it was something one of my other sons had erected, and shrugged it off as nothing. One more scarecrow wouldn't hurt anything. The next day, however, there was a new scarecrow in the east field. My oldest and my middle son, Brad and Greg, were with me as we checked the pole beans and weeded the squash. Then we came across a trampled patch of squashes. 3 perfect footprints could be seen in the remains of what had once been a large, healthy gourd. I looked down, looking for other squashed remains of vegetables, when I saw another new scarecrow. This one was dressed in a slinky black cocktail dress, complete with a pair of strappy pumps at the bottom of the post. Someone had put lipstick and mascara on the burlap sack head to complete the illusion of a woman out for a night on the town. I called for Greg, wanting him to bring me one of those pumps to check it against the squash gourd. Greg, however, was nowhere to be found. Brad came up instead and hooked one of the shoes, bringing it over to me almost gingerly. I appreciated his help, but Brad was beginning to be underfoot a bit too much. He and Greg had always been pretty close, but it seemed the two had had a falling out recently, which meant that he had spent a lot of time glued to my hip instead. I didn't mind my son's company, but a 16-year-old boy should really be out chasing girls instead of being underfoot all the time. Greg materialized out of the field then, brushing corn silk from his hair, and I wondered when he had had time to get over to the corn. I shrugged it off, holding the pump over the mark to prove what I already suspected. It was a perfect match. "What does it mean, Daddy?" asked Brad. He was the oldest, but he had always been kind of a scared kid. His brother teased him about it, but I was starting to feel afraid of these things as well. This whole thing was a little creepy. People wandering around and leaving scarecrows in my field at night was more than a little spooky. I looked around the rows of pole beans as if I expected to see someone crouching there, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn freeze that was fast approaching. I don't know, but I intend to find out. I told my wife about my plans that night and saw her look less than enthused. "So you want to sleep tomorrow, letting your sons handle the day duties, so you can keep watch in the hay barn tomorrow night?" "That's the plan." "Dale, who cares if people are leaving scarecrows in the field? One more scarecrow won't. It's not the scarecrows. These people are trespassing and damaging my crops. I can't have that." In the end, she only shrugged and told me to do what I wanted. As I made my plans, however, it seemed that our mysterious troublemakers were making their own plans. My sleep ended at about 10 o'clock as my oldest came to wake me up. "Sorry, Daddy, but you're going to want to see this." On that account, he had been wrong. I didn't want to see it, but I needed to see it. Someone had ruined 8 of our pumpkins. This wouldn't have been such a loss. We had a whole field of pumpkins. But these pumpkins were in the small field near the barn. This was where we grew our state fair pumpkins. We had planted 20. Of those 20, only 15 had taken. Of those 15, only 7 were left, and 2 of those 7 would have to be pulled up by their roots since they had been trampled. In the small patch, 7 scarecrows made a small circle in their midst. I helped Brad dispose of the pumpkins, and then I helped him with his usual chores. Greg was nowhere to be seen, and calling for him did very little. We had nearly cleaned up all the pumpkins by the time he came wandering out of the field to ask what had happened. Greg had been a strange boy as of late. He had always been so happy and outgoing, but this season he had been very moody. He spent a lot of time in the fields, just exploring and being out of the house, and I found myself wondering if he was smoking or maybe he'd picked up a habit he didn't want us to know about. My wife said it was just a boy hitting that age, and reminded me that Brad had gotten a little moody at 13 as well. Strange part was that sometimes I almost felt like he was watching me from the crops, keeping tabs on me, watching me like I was an intruder. He helped Brad take the wheelbarrow of smashed pumpkins away, and Brad said he could handle the rest from here. They were on special leave from school due to harvest preparations, and he said that the two of them could handle the rest of today. I was up by then, though, my mind angry and my head already making plans, so I told them I would help. We found 5 more scarecrows, and that had only made me more furious. What in the hell was going on? Who were these people, and why were they coming onto my farm at night and making a mess of things? I didn't know, but I intended to find out. That night, I was sitting in the hay barn with a hunting rifle and a thermos of coffee, just after 10 as the family was getting ready for bed. I swept around with my binoculars, not really wanting to look through the sight if I didn't need to. I didn't want to shoot anyone if I didn't have to, but I was prepared to fire into the air or near them to scare them. A good scare might convince them that this little joke wasn't worth the effort, and then I could go back to farming in peace. I reached for my cup of coffee, the thermos within easy reach, and that was when I heard it. From the field, wind rustled through the corn and the pole beans, and I picked up my binoculars to see if I could see people in the crops or not. As I scanned, I heard a whispery voice, a spidery voice, and it called to me as I sat in the hayloft. I looked around to see if someone was calling up to me, but it was just me and the crops out here. It came again then, that low, scuttling voice that told me to come out, to walk amongst the corn, to stand amongst the squash. It told me how nice it would be to walk barefoot in the soil, and for a moment, it sounded like a pretty good idea. I had half gotten up to go do just that, and that was when I saw someone vault the back fence. I shook off the funny mumbling and sighted him in my binoculars. He was bald, a long-sleeved work shirt, standing dark with sweat, and a pair of black slacks that made him look like a floating torso in the dark. He was Darius McCann, the bartender at the Cloudy Schooner. What the hell was he doing out here? The schooner didn't even close for another 5 hours. He should be at work, slinging suds and wrangling drunks, not running through my cornfield in the middle of the night. I climbed down, taking care with my rifle as I slung it over my shoulder, and headed out into the cornfield. My flashlight looked garish as it cut through the shadows around the corn plants, but I know this field like the back of my hand. I should, after all, since I've lived here for 15 years. I've been planting corn, pumpkins, and beans since my oldest was a year old, and this is familiar ground to me. I headed out amongst the stalks, hoping to head him off, but he's not where I expected him to be. I stopped, the moonlight overhead, and turned in the direction he had been heading. I ran that way, expecting to hear the rustle any second now. Instead, I ran smack into a post. I looked up the post and felt my hair stand up on my back. On the top of the post was a scarecrow dressed in the bartender's clothes and flapping lazily in the light breeze. As I stood there, I heard others moving through the corn, taking paths at random, running off to do whatever they did that turned them into scarecrows. I'm not ashamed to say that I took off for the house. If you've never been in a tall field of vegetation with things moving around you, then you may not understand how creepy it is. As I ran, I could see faces in the rows, people peeking through the rows and looking at me from farther out. I thought for a moment that some of those faces were even familiar, but in my fear, I was fit for little more than running flat out for home. I went back inside and locked the door, needing to think about what I'd seen, already certain I had fallen asleep in the loft. When I woke up the next day, slumped across the couch to find 6 new scarecrows in the field, I knew it had been no dream. That afternoon, the sheriff came to visit me. Sheriff Dunlin bore an unfortunate resemblance to Barney Fife. He had knocked on the door about noon, just as we were sitting down to lunch, and he swaggered into the kitchen with all the pomp his 110-pound body could muster. He made his usual greeting, saying hello to my wife and sons, and then asked if he could steal me away, just for a minute. I promise he ain't under arrest or nothing. As we got on the front porch, he was already lighting one of those shitty home-rolled cigarettes. Sorry to pull you out of this, but I'm working on a couple of missing person cases, and I was wondering if you'd maybe seen any of them. I nodded, telling him I would help if I could, and asking who was missing. Darius, bartender down at the Schooner, walked off last night under some pretty weird circumstances. He told me that Darius had been cleaning glasses, serving the same 6 barflies he'd served since 9, when he had suddenly looked out the bat wings and walked away. The regulars hadn't thought much of it, but then he never came back. He's not home and he's not at the bar, so we're very curious as to where he might be, he said as he pitched his cigarette into the dirt. I asked him what this had to do with me. Well, his truck's parked near the fence of your east field, so we was wondering if maybe you'd seen him. That threw me. I hadn't even noticed the truck. I haven't yet been out to the east field today, so that wasn't altogether surprising, but it did explain how he had gotten to my house so quickly. I told the sheriff that people had been coming out to leave scarecrows on my property, probably a Halloween prank, but that they had been destroying my crops in the process. I said I thought I had seen him last night, even took him out to see the scarecrows, but he only shrugged and rolled a new cigarette. Sounds like kids playing tricks. I still can't imagine what Darius was doing in your field, but I still need to find him. If you should happen to turn him up, you'll let me know, won't you? I told him I would, and he left by way of the east field. When I came back, Thomas, my youngest, was sitting on the porch and looking out at the field. Thomas was 6 and not really old enough to help in the fields much. He tried. He wanted to be like his old man. He was a good boy. I sat next to him on the swing and looked out at the field too. What you looking at, kiddo? Just listening to him talk, Daddy. That made me furrow my brow a little. Who? I asked, trying to hear what he was talking about. The scarecrows. Can't you hear them? I looked out at the corn, the pole beans, the fields of produce, and shuddered a little as I watched the breeze play amongst it. I suppose I could hear something like I had heard the night before. It was a strange kind of whispering. I could hear it amongst the rattle of stray corn husks, or the chuckle of bending stalks. But there was a harsher noise too. The creaking of old wooden stakes was audible in the wind now, and the chorus spoke of something very different. The call to the earth, the love of the land, the coming of the cold, the coming of the green. I shook my head and told Thomas not to stay out here too long. That night I was back in the barn, keeping watch over the crops. I didn't need the coffee tonight. I had only to think about what my son had said and remember what I had heard scuttling through the fields to keep my spine chilled. Autumn was in the air, and it sounded as if the spirits were at work. City folk sometimes forget that fall is a time of growth, but it's also a time of loss. We may lay back to prepare for the coming winter, but the earth must also prepare for that hard freeze. Sometimes the earth is greedier than even we can imagine. They started coming in about 11. I could see them parting the corn as they ran. I tried to follow them with my binoculars, but it was in vain. I would lose sight of them, only to find a scarecrow a moment later. I was becoming frustrated because they never popped back up, and the scarecrows would just go up. But how were they getting out again? They would make such a production of going into the field, only to disappear. What the hell was going on? Were they burrowing out like moles? Then a screen door opened, and my attention was pulled back to the house. I saw a little ghost in a long nightshirt streak out into the cropland, his bare feet smacking the cold earth. I called out to him, but he never stopped. I cried out pitifully as he entered the corn, but he was gone amongst it in an instant. I leapt from the loft, giving no concern to falling, and thankfully landed in a deep pile of hay. I was out and running in an instant, bolting for the place I had seen him disappear. I was hot on Thomas's heels as he dashed into the thick rows. His little nightgown, one of my old undershirts, flew behind him like a cape. Despite my long legs, he stayed one step ahead of me, and as we came into a patch of moonlight, I saw that he had stopped and stumbled to a halt myself. To this day, I don't know why I didn't just grab him. He was barely 5 feet away. I could have just reached out and grabbed him. Instead, I was almost transfixed as the sounds of those scarecrows rustled around me. He comes with the wind. He comes with the cold. He comes with the harvest. He demands his sacrifice. The words swirled around me, echoing in my head, carried by the wind, and they buffeted me like an angry sea. My son turned to look at me, his eyes reflecting the light of the moon. "The green man comes, Daddy," he whispered, his voice high and cherubic. Then he simply sank into the ground, and I heard a scream rocket up my throat as he disappeared beneath the soil. No matter how long I clawed at the earth, I could not find him. After I dug a furrow 4 feet deep and still found not a trace of him, I was forced to give up. It wasn't until I turned to go that I heard the creak of a wooden post. The little scarecrow on the post was dressed only in my son's nightshirt, his charcoal face almost angelic. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. This is part 2 of Towesey Homestead, and I hope you're enjoying the series. This is night 2 of our 8-in-a-row story block. So, be sure to join us tomorrow night for part 3, The Soil Remembers. Speaking of remembering, it's time to thank our patrons. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to be one of our Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every YouTube video and every TikTok that I make. So, come on down in this season of giving and become a member of our Spooky Skeleton army. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Come back tomorrow night for another story. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.